A new biography of Ayn Rand, which has gained some attention, examines her as a Jewish figure. The title is Ayn Rand Writing a Gospel of Success from Yale University Press in the Jewish Lives series. The book's basic premise, I think, is astonishing. It argues that to understand Ayn Rand, we have to look to her Jewish background, that this had a formative, even fundamental role in shaping her thought, work, and life. Is that premise true? Was Rand really defined by her quote unquote ethnic background? And how did she herself view her personal identity and the formation of a personal identity in any person's life? To explore these issues, I'm joined today by Dr. Harry Binswanger, who is an expert in Ayn Rand's philosophy. He was also a close associate of Ayn Rand late in her life. Welcome, Harry.
Thank you. Welcome to you, to my study behind me.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you because for the reasons I mentioned, you have really deep knowledge of her thought and her works, and you knew her personally, so you have a firsthand understanding of who she was as a person. Now, this is a biography, and I think the thing I want to focus on is the premise of this book, not so much the details and the arc of the story, which I don't think are particularly original. They're derivative from other works, and there are things to say about that, and we definitely will touch on it, but I don't think that's the primary. I don't want to do that because I think that lends too much credence to the basic premise that this idea of looking at Ayn Rand through a Jewish prism is right. And I think that's where I want to start, is to challenge that premise. So Harry, one thing that strikes me is that this book is making a claim that runs directly contrary to Ayn Rand's own view of herself and her view of what her background, what role her background had in her life. So the author says, and I'm going to quote briefly here, quote, while it was previously assumed that she, Rand, did not pursue Jewish themes, this book will argue otherwise by revealing connections between Rand's formative years in a traditional Jewish milieu and the stories she told in her books, close quote. And the part that I want to start with here is, how did Ayn Rand think of herself, her own identity, self-identity, her personal identity, and how, to me, that is where a biographer should start. And if they disagree, and if they're making this contrary claim, they really have an uphill battle to demonstrate their contrary view. So maybe I'll ask you this question to help us orient to this topic. Ayn Rand has a statement that we're each a being of self-made soul. And how did she understand that? And what is that in contrast with?
It's in contrast to the thesis of this book. It's the idea that you have a fundamental choice, which is to use your mind to think, to question, to judge, and then to use your mind to direct action on that basis, or not to think and drift and be influenced by events around you, or what people are saying around you, or books you read. The central thesis of the book is that Ayn Rand was influenced. She says in the preface on page 11, XI, as it's written, I saw my task as tracing influences on Rand's work. She had no influence. She was not influenced by anyone. That's a package deal. She chose to think about what was happening around her. She chose to read and think about others' ideas, but she was not deterministically molded as if she were a lump of clay on which other people stamped their imprint.
So I want to unpack that with you a bit more, and just to put context for people who are not as familiar with Rand's thought, I just want to emphasize the central role of choice or volition or free will in her thought. And this is something you've done a lot of work on in your career as a scholar. And I just want to touch on a few things, and maybe you could share your perspective on it. So in her own statements, she emphasizes the role of choosing one's values in life versus being passive or absorbing them through osmosis or from the surroundings that we have. And this is a point that she makes really vividly in her essay, Philosophy, Who Needs It? So a lot of people end up with what she calls a mongrel philosophy, sort of a grab bag of values and passive influences and cultural influences. And if they're passive, they tend to be conformist to various things that are just out there. They pick things up off the shelf without a lot of reflection. And then if I think about the central approach in her philosophy is the reason she thinks people need philosophy, they need guidance to live and to think, is because we have to choose to think and to act. And so there's nothing impelling us independent. No, we're not puppets of outside forces. So the whole idea of philosophy as a guide to action, which is central to her whole conception of philosophy, why it's so practical in her view, why it's a necessary feature of human life, that's premised on her view of the fundamentality of volition. And this is another area where you've done a lot of work in her theory of art, not just in her art itself, which is dramatizing people making choices, but her approach to her theory of literature is that she views herself as part of a romantic school, and she defines her conception of the romantic school is it's predicated on people making choices and pursuing values that they set their mind to, as against other schools of thought, and which are very different from her approach to literature, where people are just they're influenced by background factors. So I'm interested in your reactions to, so how would you place that factor in her system of philosophy?
It's an axiom of basic nature of man that he has a fundamental choice to think or not to think, to use his mind or not. And according to whether he chooses to think or not to think, he will choose different values or accept different values if he chooses not to think. And a good example is Peter Keating in the Fountainhead, who's the antagonist to the protagonist, Howard Roark. Keating is shaped by his mother. He's shaped by newspaper columns that he reads. He doesn't think. He just accepts what's pushed on him. Whereas Howard Roark, the hero, chooses his values by a process of thought. So we see throughout the novel the different life courses that follow according to whether a person thinks for himself and decides what he wants and what he's going to dedicate himself to, or whether he stumbles into it under the influence of others. So it's absolutely basic to her philosophy, which is objectivism, to recognize that man has a basic choice. And you can even point out that to deny it, to say, well, people are influenced, Freud said, quoting another German, we are lived by unknown and unknowable forces. If that's your view, yeah, well, then you're obviously shaped by things you don't know what and you can't control. But you don't have to do that. You can shape yourself. You can think. You have a mind. So when mommy tells you you have to share your toys or you have to brush your teeth, one of which is right, one of which is wrong, I'll leave it to you to decide which. You can think about it at 4. Why? Why do I have to share my toys? Because that's the right thing to do. Why? All right, you can argue all you want, but you're going to share your toys. And you could think, she didn't answer me. So from the age at which he's old enough to understand what his parents are telling him, he can judge it. Ayn Rand certainly did. I did. It's not the hardest thing in the world to disagree with people who are very certain and pushing something on you and slapping you if you don't agree with them. You don't have to fall for that. And Ayn Rand didn't. Not that anyone was slapping her. She had a pretty nice family, but she came to her own conclusions, which are not those of her family. The idea that living through the communist revolution shaped her worldview is bizarre, as if you couldn't be anti-communist if you hadn't seen that experience that yourself, or as if she weren't already Ayn Rand when she was 12 and saw the first shots of the revolution from her apartment window, which she did. She already knew it was wrong to say man should live for the sake of the state. She already knew that she valued the heroic. She had already read inspiring fiction and already knew she wanted to be a writer. So this idea of people are helpless, passive, victims of environment or genes or whatever. Oh, I was going to say there's a contradiction in it. This is called the contradiction of determinism. There's a contradiction in saying everybody thinks what they're conditioned to think by influences. Is that what you've been conditioned by influences to believe, brother? So the statement makes it impossible to be objective. And you can't say nobody can be objective, because then that isn't objective and it has no cognitive status. So this is a well-known self-refuting nature of determinism. Free will is axiomatically true.
I was just going to build on one of your comments about how she, as you put it, at age 12, she had formed a certain view of what is right and wrong independently, and she wanted to be a writer independently of the circumstances in which she grew up. And I think the other piece that is, I think, it's uncontroversial, is that she chose a career and then she pursued it despite the odds. And so she moved to California and she lived in poverty until she was able to break through as a writer and a screenwriter and to produce a play and so on. So all those things are things she chose to do. She didn't have to do those things. She could become an accountant, she could become a teacher, she could have done a lot of different things, but she chose a certain path and she persisted in that path. And that persistence is because she really valued this goal, this career goal of she wanted to write fiction dramatizing her vision of what human life can be, this ideal. And I think that's
Right.
that's really missing from this part of what the book is about. And it's almost as if you get, well, she had to have ended up writing Howard Rourke and Dagny Taggart because of what she experienced when she was a teenager. And this just doesn't follow. Lots of people experience the same things under the communists, maybe even worse things, and they didn't end up doing the same they didn't pursue either the same path or even remotely the same path. But you were starting to press on this issue of influence, and earlier you called it a package deal. So I want to come back to that here, and let's dive into Popoff's. So the author of the book is Alexandra Popoff, and her premise, as I read aloud from her forward to the book, or a preface, is that Ayn Rand has these influences that are really fundamental to her, and that the burden of her book is to demonstrate that these were significant, more so than anyone's ever noticed before. And when I heard about this book, I thought the premise was implausible on its face. When I actually got to read the book recently, I thought the evidence was unconvincing and not even remotely credible. And I just want to talk about some of the kinds of things that the author brings forward as evidence that Ayn Rand was, as you put it, influenced. And I think it's important to unpack what this idea of influence is. And the first point I'll raise is that I read the book attentively, and I didn't see a definition of what, quote, Jewish means. And I think that's a difficult thing to do. So if your goal is to show that being Jewish or having grown up in a Jewish household and in a milieu influence, you have to start with, well, what does that even mean? Because one of the things that the author acknowledges is that her family were not observant Jews. They assimilated, which was an interesting phenomenon in that time period in Europe. And so being an assimilated Jew means you adopted most of the culture's practices, and they Russified their names. They didn't use their sort of more Jewish sounding names. And Ayn Rand, as the author repeatedly acknowledged, was an atheist. So it's not clear that it's a Jewish religious identity. It's not clear that it's a cultural identity, because as she points out, they were assimilated. And it's not clear in what, so she ends up leaning on the idea that Jewish is a kind of ethnicity, which is something we can talk about too. But the fact that it isn't defined, it's left ambiguous, I think it creates room for her to play with all kinds of examples that just, they don't make sense unless you're going into the book expecting to have your preconception validated, which is, oh yeah, I'm willing to
Yeah,
accept that she was a Jew, so throw something at me and I'll accept it. And that's sort of the experience I
yeah.
had with the quality of argument here.
My parody of the book in this regard is in the Fountainhead, Rourke falls in love with Dominique. And you know, in the Bible, David fell in love with Bathsheba. So it's a Jewish theme. As if, you know, you could take any kind of human story and find a Bible correlate. Yeah. And you can find it in Shakespeare and you can find it in real life. It's ridiculous to say it's Jewish. At one point, she says that she invested her character with, I'm quoting now from page 39, Rand invested her character with recognizable Jewish traits, such as, what do you think are recognizable Jewish traits? Pride and defiance. Well, some Jews, particularly Israelis, I understand, are proud and defiant, but Eastern European Jews were humble and self-abasing. It's not, pride and defiance is something that came out of Ayn Rand's personal reverence for the human potential, not out of what she saw around her. Pride she made one of the 7 virtues of her ethical system. And she defines it and she discusses it quite consciously. She isn't saying, oh, I learned this because people in my synagogue, but she didn't go to any synagogue, were proud or defiant. And defiant is a little bit a slanted word anyway. So you see why I say that in Atlas Shrugged, Reardon slaps Francisco's face. And that's a Jewish theme. Somebody slaps somebody in the Bible too, in the Old Testament. It's completely arbitrary, this assertion, and it runs counter to the fact that Ayn Rand was an independent, self-created thinking being. Now, I raised that term package deal, which, I mean, all of this that we're using to defend her, she gave us this knowledge, the theory of free will, the theory of package deals, which I'm now going to talk about. Concepts are formed, they're not revealed. They're not carved in, their meaning is not given to us, carved into some mountainside. So if you start using a concept which has 2 very different meanings as if it had one and the same meaning, that's called a package deal by Ayn Rand. And it consists of putting together in one term elements that have opposite truth value or significance or moral status. And influence, and you do that obscuring what the differences are. So influence puts together as if it were one thing, rational learning and mindless conformity. So she was influenced by the Bolshevik dictatorship. Does that mean it emotionally overwhelmed her and then she kept recycling that like some neurotic? Or does it mean she observed the events, analyzed their meaning, read the propaganda, thought about where it came from, read Marx, found the fallacies in Marx, realized that Marx came from Hegel, who came from Kant, studied Kant, realized what his fundamental error was. You know what that was? This is like, I just want to indicate the level of Ayn Rand's thinking, because she's treated here as if she's the girl next door. Ayn Rand said of Immanuel Kant, who was the most important philosopher of the last 200 years, the central premise that he holds that's wrong is that identity is the disqualifying element in consciousness. Consciousness can't know reality because consciousness has a means of knowing reality. So man is blind because he has eyes. That's the essence of Kant's philosophy. Now, a woman whose thought moves on that level is being described as if she were clay, where somebody said something to her and she's helpless but to agree with it. It's absurd.
And just to put a different kind of example forward, so in thinking about the premise of the book and why I think it's not defended, because I think it's not defensible. So here are a couple of things that's leapt out at me. Reading Rand, it's impossible, in my view, to read her attentively and come away thinking she's not an idealist. I think she's the most idealistic person I've read, and I've read quite widely. So maybe there's someone else out there, but is very idealistic in every, down to the core. And you can see that in her novels, you can see that in her nonfiction. And I think the deeper one gets into her philosophy, the more one sees why it's systematically important, because she thinks ideals are central to human life. That's missing from this book. And what you get instead is, and it's missing it in a really destructive and interesting way. So it's missing in this way. So why does Ayn Rand think the mixed economy in the United States and Western countries is bad? So the mixed economy, in her view, is the pockets of freedom polluted by influences of government regulation. And she had a deep analysis of what happens in a mixed economy and why it's an unstable mixture, and why it trends to greater controls. And ultimately, the end point of that is totalitarian control. But why does she think that? And I think my understanding is that she thinks freedom is an ideal and it's a necessary feature for human life in a social context. That's what a good society looks like. And the deviation from that is, the more you deviate, the worse it gets. And the mixed economy is a big deviation from that ideal. Now, you would never learn that from this book, because the way Ayn Rand's view of a mixed economy comes up is, it's really strange. It has to do, according to Popoff, with how Rand experienced the mixture of the Soviet regime allowing some private enterprise in, I think it's under the NEP, the New Economic Policy Period, and maybe you can correct me if I'm getting the history a little bit wrong, but, and this is something that she's dramatizing in We the Living, her most autobiographical novel. Now, it is true that you could, in some twisted way, you can call that a mixed economy, but it was really a totalitarian economy that granted the black market some legal status. So it's not even really a mixed economy in the one that we experience here in the United States. But the way Popoff presents this, it's Rand experienced that. She saw why it's bad, and that's why she thinks a mixed economy is bad in our society here in the United States and in Western countries. Now, it's so off in that it's missing the fundamental. It's such a focus on derivatives and non-essentials. So the fundamental is, Ayn Rand thought freedom is an ideal, and that's what is essentially wrong with a mixed economy. And that's not really coming through. It's more that she experienced this in the Soviet period, that marked her for life, that determined her view. No wonder she didn't like it here in the US. And that's just really missing the point of what Ayn Rand was arguing. And then one other quick example, again, under this topic of the book misses how Ayn Rand was such an idealist and why that shaped her thought. So Popoff makes the point that in her writings on business people in the United States, particularly nonfiction, that Rand is trying to push back against stereotypes of greedy Jews, because a lot of business people are Jewish, and this is her sort of, I guess, channeling her Jewish identity in her commentary on, say, antitrust or the different regulations that are throttling the US economy. I'm lost for words, because it's really not the point. Now, it might be true that part of what happens when she's defending the rights of businessmen to operate freely and unburdened by regulations that also means undoing some of the associations that business has with greed and the sort of religious context that pollutes our view of business as a, in her view, in Rand's view, business is a heroic activity, and in the sort of conventional religious context, it's not. It's sinful, it's low, it's degraded. Now, I don't think what motivated Rand is, I'm going to undo the Shylock premise that's everywhere in our culture. I'm going to vindicate businessmen who are being wrongly abused because they're Jewish. Now, I'm sure she had a concern about prejudice, and I know that. We can talk about that later. But I think her primary is she was concerned with the rational and the industrious. She thought it was a virtue to be productive. She thought it was a virtue to be creative and to trade with people, because that is the human form of interaction in an economy, and you need freedom for that. And her arguments about why it was wrong, the persecution of business in the United States, that is, from start to finish, it's shaped by her idealism about the need for freedom and the need to leave individuals free to produce and to create and to trade. And so what Popoff does is completely turn that around and make it something that is animated by a concern for Jewish identity and persecution. Now, again, it's right to be concerned with those things, but that's completely inverting what I think of as Ayn Rand's priorities, which are defined by a broad ideal, a secular individualist ideal that comes from a moral premise, versus the sort of sociological tribal perspective that I think Popoff is trying to. And so it's not credible about what animated Rand, and it's not supporting her argument.
I can give you an anecdote to confirm that. She used to speak at the Ford Hall Forum in Boston most every year, and she would get sometimes hostile questions from the audience. Once, when I attended these, and when someone asked her, "Why do you worship capitalism?" And she shot back, "I worship capitalism because I worship man." And that's exactly what you're saying. Her position on greed and capitalism was human potential cannot be fulfilled unless people are free to use their minds. The mind is the source of all values, and the mind will not function unless it's free from force. So that's why she favored a society of complete freedom, which is laissez-faire capitalism.
Just a couple of quick other examples, just because what I want to make sure people take from this conversation is that the argument the book is based on, the premise, is not defended because it's not defensible. And so a couple of other quick examples.
Yeah, that's a good reason for not defending it.
Yeah, we're told that one of Rand's grandparents or uncles, I really can't remember, I should have looked this up. One of her relations, I think it was her grandfather, was an attorney in Russia. And the author speculates, more than speculates, that this probably or might or very strongly accounts for why Rand likes to feature courtroom scenes in her novels. And I almost fell out of my chair when I read that, because it just seems so beside the point. And I don't know if she even met this person as a young child. Maybe she did. What I understand, and I'm not a literary expert, I'm certainly not as deeply knowledgeable in Rand's works as you are, Harry, and I'm interested in your reaction to this. But my first thought was, why is she so interested in courtrooms? Well, it's this brilliant dramatic setting to vindicate a character or to expose the truth. And she has, and this is independent of her fiction, she has real reverence for the law and rule of law and the principle of a society governed by that. And I think that's why she was concerned with what happens at the US Supreme Court. That's why she was interested in the issues coming out of that. This is how a proper society functions. And to go back to the fiction, it's just such a dramatic opportunity. So, I mean, there's her play, Night of January 16th, which is a courtroom drama. There are courtroom scenes in the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And again, they are, I take them to be reflective of those interests of hers, rather than, oh, she had a relative long ago and he happened to be an attorney.
Yeah, it's crazy. A lot of writers use courtroom dramas because they're dramas. It's the clash of two things. And Ayn Rand said that romantic art is about the portrayal of the ideal through conflict. If there's no conflict, you don't have a plot. And if you don't have a plot, you don't have a story or a novel. You just have a recounting of a series of events. This is also something that Popoff gets wrong in her books. She says, this is from page 95, ideas were always more important to her than a plot, which serves chiefly as a vehicle for her message. Well, certainly that fails to explain what Ayn Rand said. She said the three most important elements in a novel are plot, plot, and plot. It fails to explain why she thought Mickey Spillane was a great writer and everybody despised him. It fails to explain how millions of readers who don't get the ideas at all are fascinated by her stories, read them even though they are 1,000 pages in the case of Atlas Shrugged, and then reread them. I know a doctor who said he was rereading Atlas Shrugged and was praising it. And I said, what would you say is the central message of Atlas Shrugged? Now, Ayn Rand described the central message as the role of the mind in human existence. His answer was, some people game the system. So obviously the ideas pass entirely over his head. If the plot was just a vehicle for those ideas, how come he loved it and was rereading it? So it's just totally implausible. And she picks that up from other people. Mm-hmm. You know, on the Donahue show, one of Ayn Rand's late in life appearances was on the Phil Donahue show. And Donahue turns to her and says, you know, some people think you're crazy. And she said, no, they want you to think I'm crazy. So in the same way here, it's not that there's any evidence to support these claims about her and the background shaping her and all the rest that we're talking about. It's that other biographers have claimed that because it fits with their worldview, not because it's true. It wasn't true. And I'm speaking of someone who knew her well, which none of these biographers ever even met her.
So I want to add one other example, and then I want to turn back to this issue of influence, because there's an aspect of this biography, which again is derivative from other biographies, which emphasizes the quote influence of Nietzsche on Rand. I think we should talk a bit about that. I know you have thoughts on that aspect. But one final example of this attempt by the author to validate her thesis, which I think again is taken from page 100. It's a not at all credible and an example of arguing through non-essentials and just I think it just gives you the quality of what the book's approach is. So the author observes that, quote, Rourke presents an idealized version of Rand herself. Continuing the quote, curiously, this character also resembles the type of the, quote, new Jew imagined by Zionists who replaced Jewish powerlessness in the diaspora with traits necessary to succeed in Palestine, end quote. Well, it's similar to your parody earlier in the conversation, Harry, where if you see anyone with a positive trait, you can associate it with something positive that you've seen in sort of the wider Jewish culture, broadly defined. And there is something to say about what the Zionist conception of what it means to be a Jew versus the traditional Eastern European conception. But again, I think to make that kind of point, you would have to do a lot more work to get evidence that this is what animated Ayn Rand, because there's so much evidence to the contrary, that what really animated her is this point from earlier in the conversation, which is, you put it, it's her, she worships man. She worships the ideal, the sublime in human beings, the potential that every one of us has to become like Rourke in essential ways, not to be an architect in that concrete bound way, but just to be the kind of person that he was in essentials, like a productive, industrious, and independent-minded person, and that's something to aspire to. That's part of what is so distinctive to Rourke. That's not at all what I think the Zionist conception of the new Jew was. I mean, you could say there's a resemblance, but that doesn't demonstrate her thesis that Rand's Jewish milieu and background really defined who she was, to the point to say that Rourke really is this strong resemblance with the Zionist conception. It's a weak argument, and it's contradicted by so much else in Rand's stated positions and in her fiction and in her life as well. So let's talk a bit about some other aspects of what the book is arguing. And you've earlier argued, explaining what a influence is and how it operates in this book. And you've argued that it's a kind of package deal, putting together things that really don't belong in essential ways or in important, distinctive ways. So how do you understand the argument that comes up in this book that is, as I take it, it's the Fountainhead really is a Nietzschean book? That's what the author wants us to take in my reading of this. And again, this is not something original to Popoff. A lot of people have made this claim. And Rand, I think she had a statement about her influence, her view of Nietzsche early on in the writing of the Fountainhead versus later on, and then even later in her intellectual life. So can you shed some light on this?
Yeah, I think that the Fountainhead was what drove any element of Nietzscheism out of her. Gail Wynand was a Nietzschean figure. He was after power. That's what he said. I'm after power. And he, at the end, realizes, as he says, a leash, he wanted a leash on the mob. He says, a leash is only a rope with a noose at both ends. He realized that power is not a worthy goal, and that he had devoted his life to something that he thought was worthless. And in the movie, he kills himself. He doesn't do that in the novel, but she wrote the screenplay for the movie. So it was through seeing Gail Wynand, who's a very sympathetic character and a tragic one, creating the events of his life and contrasting him to Rourke, who is not interested in power in the slightest, only interested in creative things, particularly architecture, his field. It's through that kind of working out of how it evolves in a person's psychology that she drove any respect for Nietzsche's will to power or Superman out of her system. And I think she came in with some admiration for Nietzsche, still knowing that he was not her kind of person, but he has some very good statements if you take them out of the context of his philosophy. He was a determinist. Anyway, so she came in, I think she was going to put quotes from Nietzsche in the head of each of the sections of her novel. But by the end of that novel, she realized, because she had a mind and she used it, she realized, no, power over others is just another form of second-handedness. And Rourke says that. Rourke thinks to himself. I didn't tell him that the worst second-hander is the man who seeks power, because he loved Gail Wynand, not for that side of him, but for his virtues. And he was afraid what was going to happen when Wynand realized that he had wasted his life on seeking power, which was not a worthy pursuit. So the other data point I would point to is that she relates in her biographical interviews that when she was a teenager in Russia, her cousin Nina told her about Nietzsche and said, he beat you to your ideas. Now, what does that imply? But later, she read Nietzsche. I mean, not shortly thereafter, she read Nietzsche and realized it wasn't really her ideas. But anyway, that implies Ayn Rand already had her ideas of individualism, hero worship, reason. And Nina was saying somebody else published them. before you, because she had never read a word of Nietzsche at that point. So the idea that Nietzsche molded her as a passive deterministic puppet is completely contrary to the facts. But facts don't stop her in defending the thesis that she was influenced by her ethnicity. Influence, there I go using that word. It's wrong.
So I want to pick up on that idea of ethnicity, because what is remarkable to me is I don't think the book seriously engages with the fact that Ayn Rand had an analysis of this idea of ethnicity, and she wrote about it at length. And one of the places people can go is her essay "Global Balkanization," which you can also listen to. It was a lecture as well. And what the essay is trying to do is to explain. This is in the early 70s or late 60s, I forget exactly, but it's trying to explain the
70.
rise. Yes, I think early 70s, right?
Yeah.
So what it's trying to do is explain the rise or the resurgence of tribalism in Western countries, particularly. So, and this is in the context of particularly of separatist movements in Quebec and in France and in Spain and in Italy and even in the United Kingdom and all across Western Europe and including the United States. There was sort of this heightened awareness of group identity broadly understood, and ethnicity was a concept at the time that was, I think, relatively new in sort of outside of academic circles. And she analyzes ethnicity, and again, I think in her mind, it's putting together things that don't really go together. It's putting together race and culture, so things that are unchosen and things that are chosen or essentially chosen. Culture is a mixture of things. So she has a deep analysis of ethnicity, and she rejects ethnicity as a concept. She doesn't use it except to criticize it. And she has a philosophic account of this growing tribalism that I think we're living through now. So she saw coming what we're living through today. This whole idea is now manifesting in the woke versus the more sort of right-wing nationalist white identity kind of different tribes, but they're all essentially tribal. She saw this coming. She argued that it's rooted in a philosophic failure. The role of philosophy should play isn't being played by proper philosophy, and it's leading people to seek a group for some kind of security, and it's a not a good thing to do. It's not a good place to be to want to be part of a tribe. Now, I'm giving you just a thumbnail sketch of her analysis in Global Balkanization, and in other places she talks about this issue too. The relevance of this is, if you're writing a book arguing that Rand's ethnicity was important, if not central, to who she was as a thinker and how her life unfolded, I think it's important to engage with her analysis to at least say she had this view, and I disagree with it. And I still think that her Jewish background is, whatever that means, is central. So, but I don't really think that comes through in the book, and that's a big gap. That's I think it's a mistake not to engage with it seriously.
Incidentally, I think one of the successes that she had was in introducing the word tribal and tribalist into the intellectual discussion. And it's now a commonplace term that you can see in editorials and op-eds. When she first used it, I think it was in Capitalism, What is Capitalism from 1965. I had never heard that word used before. And I think it's due to her influence. People see that it fits, that we are splitting into tribes. So that's one of the few things where she succeeded in changing the terms of the discussion. But the whole thing comes back to the mind as volitional. Man is a being of volitional consciousness. And if you don't think that human beings can form ideas on their own independently without succumbing to what other people are telling them, then you have to be racist and ultimately tribalist, because you say, I can't know what's true, but I have to do something. So the easiest thing to do is to do what the people around me are doing, the people I'm familiar with, the people in my immediate subculture or environment. And if you don't trust your mind, the most obvious manifestation of who is your kind of person that you should conform to is what they look like. So it devolves into people who look like you feel I can trust them because my mind didn't have to figure out I can trust them. They look like me, so they must be like me. It's so mindless. And individualism, which Ayn Rand, as Popoff acknowledged, held as the essence of the proper social and ethical orientation, says the individual makes himself. The individual is able to run his own life by his own mind. She takes that deeper and says, yeah, it's the mind, it's thinking, it's focusing your mind to clear awareness. And that's the choice. No one had ever said that before.
So, Harry, we're going to wind down in a few minutes, but a couple more points I think are worth touching on. So, one is I was arguing that we're living through something that Ayn Rand noticed the beginnings of, the rise of ethnicity and tribalism as we're experiencing it today. And she wrote and spoke about it with a deep analysis. That what is also true, and we've seen this especially since October 7th, is there is a growing or more assertive anti-Semitism in the Western world, particularly in North America. We've seen that on college campuses. And I want to talk with you a bit about Ayn Rand's attitude to anti-Semitism. Now, for people not that familiar with her thought, as you put it earlier, Ayn Rand was vehemently against racism. She saw it as a form of collectivism. It denies the individual's identity, it denies their mind and the efficacy of their mind. It treats people as determined by their biology. And I think she saw tribalism as a really low form of collectivism, probably the lowest form. Now, but you had experience with her on this kind of issue, and you're quoted in Popoff's books. I want to get sort of what is your understanding of her reaction to anti-Semitism when she experienced it or saw it?
Well, she got some of the details on Popoff did of the story, but the essence is correct that I had person I knew and whom Ayn Rand knew, who had been on a cruise where someone was making anti-Semitic remarks. And this woman was a Jew, and she called out the person for making anti-Semitic remarks. But she didn't say, I'm a Jew. And some people were raising that as a moral concern. And my position was, well, as long as she called out the anti-Semitism, why does she have to say I'm a Jew? And I mentioned it to Ayn Rand. And she said, no, she should have. She had an obligation to say, I'm a Jew. I always say I'm a Jew when I experience anti-Semitism. In fact, the only time I am a Jew is when there's anti-Semitism. So that is her viewpoint, was that being Jewish or having Jewish connections, being of Jewish descent, however you want to put it, was the farthest thing from her mind. But if someone was anti-Semitic, she said, you're talking about me.
How do you understand that? Is that her? Was it her view that that's an exclamation point on the calling out of the person for being anti-Semitic, and sort of emphasis that you aren't aware that I'm a Jew, and therefore it's even more significant?
Well,
how do you process that?
I can make a guess, but there's so many. The one thing that I should have done more of in my many hours of discussion with her is said, why? I didn't say why enough because she always was interested in explaining it. And I didn't ask her, why do you think it's, I was just impressed, that, oh, so I think she, guessing at it, or what I introspect about myself in that case, is self-assertion. It's a refusal to take guilt. It's a refusal to be afraid of the opinion of somebody who is a complete idiot and bastard for being an anti-Semite. So it's standing up for yourself, even though you don't identify as a Jew. It's not to say it is a little bit self-effacing.
That's interesting. I was speculating earlier before we started recording, why might she have that view? And one guess I had, and I'm curious if you think what perhaps this was part of it. I sometimes think of it these days, particularly in the climate we're in, where it's so much more salient than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago. There's an aspect to it now, which is it's like the Spartacus phenomenon, is that I'm Spartacus. So what you're doing is you're against everything good. So I'm going to stand up with people who are being persecuted or being vilified. And it's incidental that I might be Jewish, but I'm Spartacus. And in the same way that one would stand up for the principle of free speech by saying, I'm against what you say, but I stand up for the idea of judging people individually, not by the unchosen features of their background, and that's perverse, that's prejudicial, and so forth. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, and I just want to flag this is my speculation. I don't really have any insight into how she viewed it, other than what you've mentioned today.
No, I think it's more what I said. It's John Galt standing up at the factory meeting when the speaker is saying this is in accordance, this collectivist plan we're announcing is in accordance with the moral code that we all accept. And there are hundreds, maybe 1,000 people, and John Galt stands up and says loudly, I don't, and walked out. It's that, I think.
So let's draw some of these threads together, and I want to give you the final word, Harry. So as I was arguing, and I think we've tried to show the book's basic premise that to understand Rand, you have to understand her Jewish upbringing, her Jewish identity, her ethnicity. It's not defensible. It's really missing the point of who she was fundamentally as an idealist, an original philosophic mind, and someone who understood and emphasized the fundamental role of individual choice, of volition in human life, and that we each define ourselves, that it's a responsibility to do it, and people default and they end up with what she called a mongrel philosophy, or a character that is in significant ways a result of passivity and conventionality and so forth. But that doesn't mean that that's all of our fate, that it's a choice, that's a default on a choice. And so it's wrong to understand her or anybody as fundamentally determined, because you made the point earlier that determinism is an incoherent position, and that was her view, that it was an incoherent position. You won't have to acknowledge that that's part of her analysis. So any final thoughts or reflections on the book? And as I said, my goal was not to analyze it as a biography with here where she, because I think there are definitely errors and misinterpretations, but I don't want to give those significant attention, because the elephant in the room is the premise of the book that I think has to be pushed back.
Yeah, that's the elephant in the room. But you made another point that is worth picking up on for a certain purpose. You said that she rehashes other biographers' statements, which themselves are distorted and wrong. She does that to Ayn Rand's husband, Frank O'Connor, and she says, the real Frank was the opposite of heroic, meek, sensitive, accommodating. Well, I knew him, and he wasn't. He was very genteel and cultured and aristocratic, but I remember, for instance, an occasion after a lecture where a student, as Ayn Rand was gathering her possessions and starting to walk out, she would often be accosted by people asking questions. And one kid was arguing with her about something she said. And she said, are you arguing with me? And the kid said, you're attacking me for my ideas. And Frank was there, and he chimed in, you don't have any ideas. And then they left. Now, is that meek, sensitive, and accommodating? No. And she described Frank to her sister in a letter as my Rock of Gibraltar. He's more uncompromising than I am. I'll give you one more. Do we have time for one more Frank O'Connor story? This is, she told this to me, but I only know it that way. Frank was arrested when they were living in California for speeding. She wasn't there. And he didn't think he was speeding. So it was probably one of these speed traps. They hauled him before the judge and said, if you plead guilty and pay the fine, you can go home. And he said, I don't know what he said, but he denied that. And they said, well, you have to go to prison. So he spent the night in jail because he was convinced that he was innocent and would not go along with, okay, I'll pay the money and get it. He was convinced of his innocence, so he spent the night in jail. That's not meek, sensitive, and accommodating. That's proud and defiant, which are supposed to be Jewish characteristics, but Frank was Irish. Oh my God.
Well, Harry, thanks for sharing thanks for sharing your personal recollections and for giving us your insight onto Ayn Rand's life and thought. I really appreciate it. And just final thought on this book. I don't want to compare it to other biographies. I have an article I'm writing about some of the other biographies, and I'll comment on them there. But I think one thing in the book's favor, which I just want to acknowledge, it's while I completely disagree with the premise, I think it's not a defensible one. I don't think the author is coming in with an axe to grind, which is a rare thing when people write about Ayn Rand. Now, she has some interpretations I disagree with, and some of them are snide, but I don't think it's the typical kind of thing that I've seen in the last few decades where people going into this have a certain agenda of trying to level her down in an important way. Now, I think there is a leveling down implied in the premise of the book, and I think that's part of what we've been talking about. But the author was commissioned to write this. I don't think it was her idea exactly. And I think that's that accounts for some of why the book looks the way it does. And I don't think it's a very effective book in its attempt to demonstrate its basic premise. So I think it's important to acknowledge that, but none of that should be a recommendation, because I don't think one can gain insight into Ayn Rand as a thinker and as a creative mind by understanding her through this prism of a tribal/ethnic identity. And I think it's misguided. No. So I'm disappointed by that, and I didn't find the book valuable from that perspective.
Yeah, you're right. It's not snide, it's not hostile, but it is basically mistaken. So I would not recommend reading it, but not because it's evil or hostile or anything, but just it's a little sloppy, and the central thesis is absurd.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think it's where we should draw a line. So we've been talking about the book Ayn Rand, Writing a Gospel of Success, and I think even the subtitles, we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but I dislike the subtitle, and I think it misses the point again in fundamental ways, like the rest of the book. But with that, let's draw a line here and encourage everyone, if you're interested in Ayn Rand's own view of her development, read the essay, The Goal of My Writing, where she talks about what motivated her to dedicate her life. She was very career-driven, and you have to understand her through her career and through her work. The Goal of My Writing is an important piece to read. And on ethnicity and tribalism, as she understood it, read Global Balkanization or listen to the lecture. I think those are really important in understanding who she was and what her analysis of these issues were. Harry, thanks for joining today.
Thank you for having me.